good afternoon. This is David Vandenberg. I'm welcoming you to our debate today. We're being hosted by the El Paso Lawyers chapter of the Federalist Society. We welcome everyone today. Our topic today is resolve that Congress should pass H.R. 1, the For the People Act. And we have two debaters today. In the affirmative, we have Dan I. Weiner of the Brennan Center at NYU, New York University. And for the opposition, we have Bradley A. Smith, chairman and founder of the Institute for Free Speech. Now, I'm just going to explain what the bill is to some degree and then introduce our debaters more fully. But the H.R. 1 for the People Act actually has passed, not Congress, but the House of Representatives. Senate 1 is now under consideration. The bill was introduced by Representative John Sarbanes of Maryland, and he calls it, quote, a transformational anti-corruption and clean elections reform package. We will clean up corruption in Washington, empower the American people, and restore faith and integrity to our government. There are a number of issues. It's an 800-page bill, so there's no way we can cover everything here. We're really focusing on two areas of campaign finance and election administration. In terms of these, Representative Sarbanes has continued to say on his own website that the bill guarantees proper disclosures. It shines a light on dark money in politics by upgrading online political ad disclosures and requiring all organizations involved in political activity to disclose large donors. The bill also breaks the, quote, nesting doll, unquote, sham that allows large contributors and special interests to hide their true funding sources. It empowers citizens. It creates a multiple matching system for small donations. Thus, according to the bill's sponsor, Representative Sarbanes will establish citizen-owned elections that will break the stranglehold of special interests over Congress. This will be paid for by a surcharge on corporate lawbreakers such as Wells Fargo, Volkswagen, and Facebook. It also strengthens oversight of elections. It tightens the rules on super PACs, restructures the FEC, Federal Election Commission, to break gridlock and enhance enforcement actions. It also repeals Mitch McConnell's riders that prevent government agencies from requiring common sense disclosures of political spending. On the other side, in opposition, just 2 weeks ago, our debater, Professor Smith, spoke before the Rules and Administration Committee at the U.S. Senate. And in his testimony, he said that the bill's extensive regulations on speech would silence many Americans and benefit Washington insiders and politicians, not the people. Labeling this bill as a, quote, For the People Act, unquote, is Orwellian. In reality, S1 would subsidize the speech of politicians while suppressing the speech of the people. Significant portions of the bill would violate the privacy of advocacy groups and their supporters, including those groups who do nothing more than speak about policy issues before Congress or federal judicial nominees. S1 would impose onerous and unworkable standards on the ability of Americans to discuss policy issues of the day with elected officials and the public. The proposal would also coerce Americans into funding the campaigns of candidates with which they disagree under a system of research that has been proven not to live up to its goals. Among the legislation's biggest violations of First Amendment rights are provisions requiring nonprofits to publicly expose their supporters when speaking about the government. These requirements will subject Americans to harassment. Quote, in a nutshell, S1 does away with the FEC's bipartisan structure to allow for partisan control of the regulation of campaigns and enable partisan control of enforcement. Now we turn to our debaters. In the affirmative for the bill is Daniel I. Weiner. He serves as Deputy Director of Brennan Center's Election Reform Program at New York University. There, he leads the center's work on campaign finance, election security, government ethics, and rule of law issues. He's the author of several nationally recognized reports on election law. He is a regular commentator for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Slate, MSNBC, and NPR. He has provided policy advice to lawmakers in Washington and nationwide. He's delivered testimony and briefings before Congress, before state legislatures, and federal and state agencies. He previously served as senior counsel to Commissioner Ellen L. Traub during her tenure as chair of the Federal Election Commission. He has also practiced law in the Washington office of Jenner Block, LLP, where he litigated at trial and on appeal, counseled a wide array of regulatory clients, and maintained a robust pro bono practice focused on LGBTQ+ rights. Mr. Weiner received his JD from Harvard Law School, whereupon he clerked for the Honorable Diana E. Murphy of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit. He graduated from Brown University, magna cum laude in history. Outside his role at the Brennan Center, he presides over the DC Board for Professional Responsibility Committees for Attorney Discipline cases. In opposition to the bill, we have Professor Bradley A. Smith. He is one of the nation's foremost experts on campaign finance law. He was elected vice chairman of the Federal Election Commission in 2003, was a regular commissioner in 2005, and then became chairman of the commission in 2004, finally resigning in 2005. He is let me start over, strike that. A recent New York Times story referred to Mr. Smith as the intellectual powerhouse of the movement to roll back campaign finance restrictions. His 2001 book, Free Speech, The Folly of Campaign Finance Reform, was lauded by George Will as the year's most important book on governance. Trying to read my notes, he was the most sought after witness in Congress on campaign finance issues, if he's not still today. He has authored articles for the Yale Law Journal, the Georgetown Law Journal, and the Wall Street Journal, among other national publications. He has appeared on The O'Reilly Factor, Hardball with Chris Matthews, Bill Moyer's Journal, the Lehrer News Hour, Fox News Special Reports, ABC News, and other media outlets. As an FEC commissioner, Professor Smith won plaudits for his integrity and refused to put partisan interests ahead of his duties, as well as his steadfast support for free speech. The Wall Street Journal dubbed him the only honorable man in this, quote, bordello. And we have to wonder which bordello they're referring to. Maybe we'll learn this in this debate. Mr. Smith now serves as the Josiah H. Blackmore II and Shirley M. Knott Designated Professor of Law at Capital Law School in Columbus, Ohio. He graduated cum laude from Harvard Law School and received his undergraduate education at Kalamazoo College in Michigan. So now, I invite Mr. Weiner to present his position in affirmation of the passage of the bill.
Well, thank you so much. And I should have excised out some parts of my bio that folks probably won't be so interested in, because everyone knows my life story. But it is such a pleasure to be here today, and I want to express my gratitude to you, David, and to Professor Smith, and also to the Federalist Society for being willing to have this conversation about the For the People Act. So this is a bill that the Brennan Center and I personally strongly support. And we're going to talk about several aspects of it today, hopefully both the campaign finance and also the voting rights provisions. And we're going to start with campaign finance. And what I would like to do is use the time I have here to talk about some of the bill's key provisions, and also hopefully clear up some misconceptions about what it does and doesn't do. I don't think necessarily or expect that at the end of this call, everyone will end up supporting the For the People Act the way I do, but I hope that what we'll do is find that we have more common ground than maybe we might have previously thought. So let's talk about the money and politics provisions of the bill. One of the most important aspects that you touched on when you talked about Representative Sarbanes' statement is its small donor matching provisions. And the For the People Act does create a system of voluntary small donor matching for Senate, House, and presidential elections. And the way this works is fairly simple. For every dollar someone gives a participating candidate, who's someone who's agreed to abide by the restrictions of the program and also raised a threshold amount of small contributions, that candidate gets $6 in matching funds. And as I said, the program is entirely voluntary. Candidates don't have to participate. What it does is it gives candidates who wish to a way to fund their campaigns relying on donations from ordinary Americans instead of the very small group of very wealthy backers on whom, for whether they like it or not, most people running for federal office right now do have to inordinately depend. And here, Professor Smith and I will probably disagree, but I do think that there is reams and reams of social science evidence that shows that the views of this small group of donors do carry significantly more weight than the views of ordinary Americans in fashioning public policy, particularly, frankly, around economic issues like trade, the economy, jobs, things that affect people's bread and butter, things around the kitchen table. And I do think that the role of campaign money plays a role. The other thing that small donor matching does is that it allows folks from modest backgrounds who may not have the sort of wealthy networks and connections that other federal candidates do to mount viable campaigns without those kind of networks by creating an alternative path to doing so. So I think small donor matching is a great deal for American voters and for the American public. And in that respect, I do think I want to clear up just a couple misconceptions. And the first of which is that this is not some new radical idea. We've actually had small donor matching in presidential elections and presidential primaries since the 1970s. Every Republican president, from Gerald Ford to George W. Bush, used the presidential public financing system. President Reagan won re-election in a landslide under the system without holding a single fundraiser. So, the first major party presidential nominee to completely abandon the system actually was President Obama. So this is not some radical progressive idea. It's actually something that's been a part of American politics for quite a while. And then the second thing I do want to clear up is that the version of small donor matching in the For the People Act does not rely on taxpayer funds. And again, Representative Sarbanes' statement that you quoted alluded to that. It relies on a trust fund established through relatively modest surcharges on corporate penalties from very large corporations and also tax penalties from the very, very wealthiest people who evade their taxes. And if the trust fund doesn't have enough money, the match is reduced. There is no additional tax burden under the For the People Act. So that is one critical version of the bill. Now, you alluded also to, its transparency provisions. And this is obviously also a very important aspect of the legislation. When the Supreme Court decided Citizens United, which is, I suspect, a decision that most people listening in approve of, it very much predicated that decision on the assumption that all the new spending, all the new corporate and other types of spending that it greenlighted would be transparent as to the ultimate source of the funds. But the reality, as we've seen, is that a significant amount of the new campaign spending that resulted from Citizens United and corporate in other cases is not transparent. We do not know the source of the funds. And in fact, it often comes from groups with vague sounding names. Stephen Colbert parodied this, Americans for America. That's a name you could have for a group that often is in the form, it's spent on ads that actually have nothing to do with what the ultimate backers behind these sorts of ads actually want from the government. And this is very much a bipartisan phenomenon. I really want to emphasize that. Democrats actually benefited more from so-called dark money in the last election cycle than Republicans did. So this is not something that just one side is doing. Dark money is also an avenue for foreign money to evade the prohibition on foreign nationals taking part in our electoral campaigns. It's an avenue for that to come into our system. Most of what the For the People Act does is it simply closes these loopholes that the Supreme Court seems to have assumed didn't exist at the time it decided Citizens United, and it applies only to large expenditures totaling $10,000 in an election cycle, which is far beyond the means of ordinary Americans. There are some lower limits and lower disclosure thresholds for online paid communications, and that's rooted somewhat in the different realities of online advertising, where even a small expenditure relatively can reach many, many people. This is actually part of legislation that none other than Senator Lindsey Graham co-sponsored. So it's, again, not some only radical progressive proposal. And that only applies to paid online communications. It does not apply to ordinary interactions over social media that you and I and everyone else have. So again, I think this is a reasonable set of reforms that is overwhelmingly popular with Americans. Now, the third aspect of the For the People Act, which probably Professor Smith and I, having both worked at the Federal Election Commission, feel very strongly about, is an overhaul of campaign finance enforcement. Now, the Federal Election Commission is the agency that is currently responsible for that. It is evenly divided, and by tradition, although not by law, it's evenly divided between Republican and Democratic appointees. My view, and I'm sure we're going to have an interesting conversation, the FEC is not doing its job. It barely ever writes new rules, despite a rapidly changing legal and also, communications landscape. Our campaigns have gone online in a way that, was not foreseeable the last time the FEC engaged in a major rulemaking process. It deadlocks on most significant enforcement cases without even investigating them. And it frequently actually deadlocks even on requests for routine guidance to candidates, parties, and PACs. So my view on this is that whatever rules we have on the books, they should be fairly and vigorously enforced in an even-handed fashion. If they think the rules are wrong, they should be repealed, not left to linger on the books, to basically overtake unsuspecting, unsophisticated players, while the folks who have enough sophistication or enough money to hire expensive campaign lawyers know that they can evade them. And I can say this as someone who worked at the agency and also works in this area, that I would rather have an FEC that is run by people who from time to time I disagree with than I would have a commission that just doesn't work at all. And basically, that's what the For the People Act does. It brings the FEC structure into line with that of other major independent regulators. And the provisions that do so are based on a bipartisan bill that was introduced in the last 3 Congresses. So again, this is not a radical proposal. The biggest criticism that I've heard, of course, is that it would lead to a partisan takeover of the commission. But in fact, and I'm happy to discuss this in the Q&A or otherwise, there are more safeguards, legal safeguards in the For the People Act to prevent a partisan takeover of the FEC that exist under current law, where the system actually would be quite easy to gain. Lastly, I just have a minute left. I just want to speak. The last aspect of the bill that is worth mentioning is that it shores up direct contribution limits to candidates, which is something that the Supreme Court has long said is unconstitutional. In Citizens United, we can return to, the court was very clear that the new spending that it greenlighted would have to be independent of candidates. The court has long said that if spending is not independent, it is coordinated, that spending is basically equivalent of giving a candidate cash. The reality, which again the court didn't anticipate, is that the rules actually governing independence are very, very limited, and a great deal of spending that is anything but independent of candidates does not fall under them. So what we have is we have super PACs and others working hand in glove with candidates and essentially invalidating most of the rules. For the People Act shores up those rules. It ensures that they will, campaign spending that is unlimited will be truly independent of candidates, and basically just makes good on the promise that the Supreme Court made in Citizens United. So I've run out of time. I'm sure Professor Smith will have many things to say in response to that, and we can take the rest for the Q&A.
So, Professor Smith.
Okay, well, thank you, David. Thank you to the El Paso Lawyers Society. And Dan, thanks for coming here. And I thank you all for taking some time out of your day who are here watching us this afternoon, and those who may watch it later on video. It's interesting, Dan, you covered a tremendous amount of ground in 10 minutes. I'm really impressed. And also, so I know I would be, though. I mean, we've done this before. But also, it was interesting to me that you hit on almost all the same points that I had planned to hit on. So maybe these truly are the high points in what is about an 800-page bill. But I'm going to start by suggesting that I think, and I don't mean to say this about particular people perhaps, but in an 800-page bill, it's very hard to cover much of the detail of anything. So I kind of try to sometimes just frame things as to what is going on. And there are two provisions of this bill that I think are particularly show a certain amount of cynicism toward the political system and toward the voters in the United States. The first is the public financing, the taxpayer financing provisions of the bill. And I say that because the bill says, as Dan says, it says right in there, it's the sense of the Senate that no taxpayer dollars should be spent. And then it proceeds to set up a system that commits billions of dollars a year in taxpayer dollars to pay for campaigns. The fig leaf that this is not taxpayer money because it comes from corporate fines is truly the barest of fig leaves. It's government money. It belongs to the public. It belongs to the taxpayers. You can spend it for whatever you want. You can spend it to improve election machinery in the states. You can spend it for putting cops on the street. You can spend it for midnight basketball. You can rebate it to taxpayers. Of course, it's taxpayer money. And everybody, I think, knows that. And the problem here is that government financing of campaigns has never been very popular, despite these constant claims that, oh, everybody loves HR 1 or S1. In fact, many of the provisions, when you look at specific provisions, are not popular at all. And this is sort of an intentional effort to hide the fact that most people don't want their taxpayer dollars going to candidates they don't like. If somebody gives Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez $100, the government's going to give her another 600. A lot of people don't like that idea. It also should not be lost on us that in the current environment, the way that parties raise funds have changed over the years. It used to be the Republicans were much more effective in raising small dollar contributions because they were better at using direct mail. Well, direct mail is pretty old hat nowadays, okay? And in fact, the Democrats have a huge advantage in raising small dollar contributions thanks to their advantage online in fundraising. And so going to a 6-to-1 match is to put the Democrats' already financial advantage on hypersteroids. Now, that doesn't mean it's a bad idea, but I do think one has to really question the sudden interest in so many provisions of this bill that all just happen to meet up very neatly with the short-term Democratic advantages in the election system. Secondly, there's no real evidence that these systems make a difference in the backgrounds of the candidates or the type of people who run for office. And they bring the government into campaign messaging because by putting public funds there, this is now a subject of interest to the government. This is the corporate fisc. So you can't have malfeasance or scandal. Those of you who've worked campaigns may know there's an old saying among campaign people that half the money in any campaign is wasted, but nobody knows which half, so you better spend it all. But now you're going to have the government coming in and saying, what half are you wasting? And we've seen in the states when these have been tried, there's all kinds of scandals, people using, some candidates using their government funds just to throw big parties for themselves as campaign events and things like that. We create what has been a private system into one that involves government scandal, and it brings government gradually into the messaging of campaigns, which I think is very dangerous. A second area that I also think has a certain cynicism to it is the idea of reshaping the Federal Election Commission. The Federal Election Commission has always been a 3-3 makeup, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats. It was shaped that way. It was formed after Watergate, and neither party was going to let the other use the FEC as a weapon in political warfare. It is different than most other commissions, right? The Securities and Exchange Commission or the FCC or whatever, they have rules that can be judged. Does this promote capital formation in markets? Does the Federal Communications Commission regulations seem to promote growth of broadcast and other areas within its purview and so on? But the FEC is there specifically to regulate the process by which people campaign. And there simply is too much temptation to go to partisan directions with this kind of campaigning. Now, the big fig leaf here is, well, we're not going to go to a partisan majority. We'll have an independent on it. But as I point out, the Republicans currently control the Senate 50-48, and that's why Mitch McConnell is the majority leader. Except that, of course, he's not, because as we all know, there are independents and there are independents. And the 2 independents in the Senate both caucus with the Democrats. One of them was a serious contender for the party's presidential nomination in each of the last 2 cycles, right? And what this system is going to do is it's going to lock in a Democratic president to appoint a majority of the commission through at least the 2026 midterms. And this is not only, I think, the actual threat of partisan takeover, but it's something that's very bad for the system. Americans are, if you're concerned about Americans' confidence in election, don't turn the FEC into something that is perceived as being a partisan weapon. Nowadays, whenever a candidate is targeted or found in violation by the FEC, the first response is, well, he says immediately it's partisan or witch hunt. And this response, and the reform groups use it all the time, is it takes 4 votes. You got to have some level of bipartisanship. That will be gone. And I think cynicism and legitimacy will be gone. And that's why I joined with 8 other former chairmen of the FEC in filing comments in Congress saying this would be very bad for the operation of the agency. Finally, of course, it does regulate speech. And we need to get this into some perspective. When we talk about dark money since Citizens United has been consistently between 2 and 4% of total spending in federal campaigns. It's a very small percent of the total. And the Supreme Court has long recognized that there is an ability for people to engage in political discussion and discussion of public affairs anonymously, right? The court has tended to limit disclosure to spending aimed directly at electing or opposing the election of a candidate, and not to general speech about issues. But HR 1 and S1 would expand this to get at any kind of speech that, quote, promotes, attacks, supports, or opposes a candidate or official. Well, those words have almost no meaning that the average citizen can know. In fact, we've seen in some court cases, federal courts have interpreted a bill that does nothing other than describe legislation, say it's a good idea, and urge you to call your senator with no other comment about the senator or anything else as being something that could be viewed as attacking him if the senator had taken a position on the bill, even though, by the way, in that particular case, the senator hadn't taken a position on the bill. So this would now regulate all that type of speech. Now, it would, of course, leave the media exempt and place them in even greater control of public discourse and messaging. Now, as I'm nearing the end of my time, I'll note that it would force groups to publicly identify contributors on their reports and even on the face of issue ads about political issues and so on, and commentary, put their names right up on the public screen, leaving them subject to harassment campaigns and the boycotts that are so common these days, even if the person did not give money to a group for that kind of ad. For example, who are the main dark money spending that nobody knows who they are? Well, some of the leading groups are the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Realtors, NARAL, Pro-Choice America, Gun Owners of America. The American people know what these groups stand for. They don't need to know exactly the names of individual companies. And in fact, people, businesses, companies, individuals give to these groups for many reasons, and they may not approve of any particular ad that is being run by the agency. To force their name up onto the screen and say, this is the person or organization that's funding this is wrong, and it's probably unconstitutional. It also requires groups making any kind of expenditure like this to state if their ads are in support of or opposition to a candidate, even if the group is not supporting or opposing a candidate, but merely talking about something relating to public affairs. And again, that's compelled speech that I think is not only unconstitutional, but would give members of the public an inaccurate idea of what is going on. It would also force organizations that make grants to groups to anticipate whether the groups they give to might make expenditures in the coming year. Beyond that is the coordination provision that Dan talked about, and this is very important. Note that it would make a coordinated expenditure out of any expenditure made in cooperation, consultation, or concert with, or coordinated with a person, but that it specifically goes on to say, without regard to whether the cooperation, consultation, or coordination is carried out pursuant to agreement or formal collaboration. In other words, you can now coordinate without coordinating. And it would also include if you got information just from a public statement. If the candidate goes out and says in a response to a question at a press conference, lower taxes are a key issue for me, you now have information about the campaign strategy and issues that would make your communications coordinated. And remember what that does. A corporation cannot give any money as a contribution to a campaign, and a coordinated expenditure counts as a contribution. So an incorporated group such as the Sierra Club or the Rifle Association or Right to Life or NARAL Pro-Choice, any of these groups could not spend literally even $1 to talk about it if they had some non-agreement or no formal collaboration, but had some information about what the campaign was doing. The bill also gets the Securities and Exchange Commission and the IRS back into regulating speech. We know how well that worked out last time the IRS tried that. In sum, the provisions of S1 regulate speech in ways that have not been accepted before by the U.S. public or by the U.S. Supreme Court. They put cancel culture on steroids by focusing on the identity of speakers rather than the message being spoken. They provide a system that would lead to partisan enforcement, or at least delegitimize election enforcement with the appearance of partisan enforcement. And they dedicate billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars to funding campaigns. And I think for all those reasons and more, this bill should be a no-go. Thank you.
David, can I just really
go ahead and
take just a couple minutes? I appreciate those comments, and you know, there are a couple things that I think do need to be addressed. So let's go back to public financing. On taxpayer funds, here's the reality: elections cost money, and the money has to come from somewhere. This bill does not require any additional taxpayer burden to fund public financing, small donor matching, and the reality is, I think that it is a very good use of the money. So I disagree that it's a fig leaf. I think that this is an acceptable alternative fundraising mechanism, and it's one that doesn't burden taxpayers. And I also, frankly, disagree strongly that this is something people don't want. We, I'm sure, could show competing polls, but in our work on this issue over the years, we think that this is something that we have seen many people want. New York State just passed an innovative public financing system, small donor matching, and it is passing in many jurisdictions around the country. I also disagree that it's going to favor Democrats. I mean, I think basically, if I were a Republican, I don't happen to be a Republican, it would be astonishing to concede that Republicans are not able to raise money from ordinary Americans at the same rate as Democrats. I think that just isn't true, and I think that ultimately both parties will benefit. On the FEC, I would like to say, first of all, that neither of the two independents in the Senate would actually qualify as independents under the FEC reform provisions in the For the People Act, precisely because there are safeguards to make sure that if someone says they are an independent when they're being nominated, they are a true independent. It actually has affiliation criteria. That is not something that exists under current law. Today, someone could be nominated for the FEC saying they're a Democrat, and the day before they switch office, they could be switched their registration to a Republican, and they would not fall afoul of the rules. So it is actually much easier to stack the FEC under current law than it would be under the For the People Act. As to the dark money provisions, I would only note that the Paso standard that Commissioner Smith referenced actually applies to Pasoing the election or defeat of a candidate. It does not apply to ads that reference only a candidate for any purpose. It's actually a much narrower standard. And then finally, on coordination, I would just note that it is not my interpretation of the law. It is not the interpretation of any person I know that you could be found liable under the law solely based on, your use of public information at a press conference. And if the law is passed and someone does try to be held liable for saying that they agree with what someone said at a press conference, I'm happy to join with Professor Smith in filing a comment or filing a lawsuit to say that that's not allowed.
Professor Smith?
Sure. Just a couple points. The talk about the Paso standard is worthwhile, that promote attack, support attack, or oppose standard. In theory, it has to be on the elections. But again, as we've seen, the DC District Court, three-panel judge in Independence Institute versus FEC, held that, again, an ad that had said nothing about a candidate running for office, let alone take a position on whether he should win or lose, nonetheless could be deemed to be an ad that attacked or supported the candidate's election campaign. So that gives you an idea of the kind of danger we're talking about here, and maybe how concerned we should be about the notion that public information should be enough, particularly when we have a bill that specifically says you don't need to have any actual agreement. You don't actually have to agree to coordinate your activity to have it count as coordinated activity. And I think along those lines, the other element of coordination investigations is that they are incredibly easy to allege, because almost any group that would want to run ads supporting a candidate's election or defeat probably has major legislative interest and is involved in that. And I don't mean legislative interest like Coca-Cola. I mean, it could be the Sierra Club again, or the National Resources Defense Council, or any of these kinds of groups that make up American civic life, the American Association of Retired People, and so on. It's very easy to allege coordination because you know that these groups meet with the candidates and talk with them. And once you allege it, these are amongst the most intrusive investigations that the FEC does. You have to go in, you have to talk, you have to, who said what to whom? You're going to talk about the strategy and the ways in which candidates and interest groups interact regarding legislation, regarding the function of government, regarding our pluralist democracy. And these investigations tend to take a long time and cost a lot of money. And at the end of the day, when they're done, right, even with the finding of no violation, the party that was accused has typically spent hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars in legal fees, had a bad day in the press, which always has field days with this because they love the allegations of this sort of thing. And there's no real recourse for them. They've lost staff time, momentum, and everything else. So this is a way to really make these kinds of elections, to make campaign finance more of a partisan weapon in elections. And the current FEC regulations have a number of constraints that try to make sure that that doesn't happen. Those would all be, and that these complaints, if they are bogus, could be dismissed early on. That would all be eliminated in this particular kind of situation. As to whether spending government money amounts to spending taxpayer funds or not, I'll let Dan defend that to his heart's content. It's taxpayer money, and I think we all know that.
I mean, we just disagree. I will say one thing is the FEC has not launched, or as far as I'm aware, assessed penalties in any coordination case for more than a decade. So we seem to, in the one extreme, be having a situation where coordination rules basically are a dead letter. And then, the parade of horribles you described on the other things. So if you'd like to suggest, some common ground for ways the bill could be amended, I'm all ears. And I do think, I stand by my statement. I do not think that the bill uses taxpayer funds for small donor matching. And I think regardless, this is a very good use of public resources, and we strongly support it. But I'm sure, David, at this point, you want to move on.
Well, I appreciate the robust debate between you two. So we do have some questions, and if you look at the time, we're not going to be able to get to all of them. So I'm thinking we'll favor some of the more, what I think, the shorter answers right now, because short might become long, as we will see. So one question is if the debaters would please comment on other aspects of the bill, and in particular, the allowance of 16-year-old people to vote. But you can just start with one, please.
Can I just correct that the act does not allow 16-year-olds to vote. It allows 16-year-olds to pre-register to vote once they turn 18. Now, young people in this country vote at much lower rates than everyone else. We think that they should engage in their democracy, and it's perfectly reasonable to let them pre-register. But it does not, I repeat, does not allow anyone under 18 to vote.
Well, David, let me ask you, what were you thinking? We had talked at one point about each of us talking a bit about the campaign provisions and then campaign finance provisions, and then talking a bit about the other provisions. Given the time, do we just want to handle those other provisions through the Q&A process? In other words, I need to know whether to respond to that question now or talk about it later.
Well, we're kind of freewheeling it right now because of all the questions, which I think are useful. But I would think it'd be wonderful if you could respond in that fashion and then move into your presentation. So I wanted to get some Q&A in here because I don't think we're going to get very much in at all.
Okay, well, let me on that particular question. It's a good question, and no, it does not allow 16-year-olds to vote. It does register 16-year-olds to vote. Now, I think this is a problem because of some of the other registration provisions that are in the bill. David, I just want to make sure, you want me to go ahead and address sort of all the election administration provisions now?
Yes, please.
Okay. So let's talk about it. And I'll start up actually more at the top. I want to make a couple of points. First, anything I say here does not reflect the Institute for Free Speech, which takes no position on these provisions of Division A of the bill. So these are just my personal views on this and not those of the Institute for Free Speech. But let me begin with a couple of observations. First, voter fraud is not a big problem in the United States. That said, until last year, it would have been entirely uncontroversial to walk into any conference and say there's more fraud in absentee ballots than there is in in-person voting. The New York Times had noted that. Advocates of easier voting, such as Professor Richard Hazen, had noted that in the pages of the New York Times. And second, let me note that while voter fraud I do not consider to be a major problem, I would also note that there have never been fewer obstacles to voting in the United States than there are today. No state had no-fault absentee voting until 1980. Prior to 2000, early voting was almost unheard of. Provisional balloting, extremely rare. Drop boxes? What? No, we didn't have drop boxes for your ballots. One could fairly say that there's no country, I think, that makes it easier to vote in the United States. A possible exception might be Australia, where voting is mandatory. But while there are fewer obstacles for some, my guess is that the median Australian has to put more effort and inconvenience into voting than does the median American. France, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, Finland, most of the democracies of Eastern Europe all ban absentee ballots for people living in the country. Spain, England, Ireland, and Denmark require photo IDs to vote absentee. 6 of the 27 countries in the European Union ban absentee voting, even for people who are not in the country at the time of the election. And yet S1 and HR1 operate on the assumption that the major problem in US elections is that it's too hard to vote. And for that reason, it then federalizes virtually every aspect of the voting system. It imposes early voting, mandating 15 days. It imposes automatic registration. And this is where people are concerned that maybe it would register illegals and so on. And it might, right? You can be registered through motor vehicles, through welfare offices, through federal agencies such as Social Security, the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Note that registration is not the same as voting. It doesn't allow illegal aliens to vote. It doesn't allow 16-year-olds to vote. But this mass registration will, I think, cause substantial duplication of registrations and will register large numbers of non-voters, including, obviously, 16 and 17-year-olds. And at the same time, it limits the ability of state officials to remove names from the voter rolls, to clean up these lists. It mandates same-day registration, so election officials have no time to verify if the voter's information is correct. Mandates online registration, which might open up things to hacking. I'm not sure that our security is enough that we really want that. It mandates no-fault absentee voting. So I've already noted, this is not what most countries do. Most countries go in the opposite direction. But furthermore, it would prohibit ID requirements to verify the absentee voter's identity, and it would prohibit signature matching to verify the absentee voter's identity. It would then force states to accept ballots up to 10 days after election day. Now, this is ripe for fraud because, of course, after election day, you begin to have a pretty good sense of how many votes you actually need to win a race, and it allows, and many votes can be done late, it's easy to postmark things, right? Backdate the postmark, have the envelopes postmarked already, and then send them in afterwards. And it would require states to allow the practice known as ballot harvesting, where paid operatives of campaign can go around and assist, so to speak, a person in filling out the ballot, and then take that ballot, have custody of it, and deliver it to the voting booth. Many states over the years and most foreign countries do not allow ballot harvesting because of concerns about intimidation, outright fraud. It's generally not considered a good practice. This mandates it. It removes restrictions on voting by felons, including those who haven't completed their sentences. And it includes various other provisions, such as mandated redistricting commissions and things like that. Now, though I've noted that I don't think fraud is currently a major problem in American elections, there is voter fraud. I mean, it is there. This bill seems designed to make sure that it does become a major problem in our elections. And it would create huge problems of legitimacy, the basic belief that election results can be trusted. And I think this is already a problem. It's a problem not just in the Republican Party, it's a problem in the Democratic Party. Right now, you have over half of Americans believe that one of the last 2 elections was won by somebody who didn't actually win it. And the numbers between Republicans who think Trump actually won and Democrats who think Clinton actually won are not much different, and they hold there. The notion to me that convenience is the most important or even the only criterion for determining if voting laws are accurate, I think eats away at the notion that voting is an intrinsically public act. It's how we govern ourselves as a people. Obviously, voting needs to be accessible to all, and efforts to restrict voting, to create artificial barriers to voting, are problematic. There should be plenty of polling places with enough staffing to avoid gratuitously long waits. But while we have to retain a secret ballot, voting is and should be a public act. It's a civic act. The voter should reflect on the public consequences of his actions, because voting is not only a right of the individual, but it's a means by which we assert power over our fellow citizens. And voting should require effort, not arbitrary or unreasonable effort, not barriers targeting specific groups, but it ought to be at least as difficult as, say, buying a pair of jeans, getting your car repaired, or making flight reservations. It should require some effort that reflects the civic significance of the act. And again, it should be done by secret ballot, but publicly in a public place, because this is a public act, part of our self-governance. It is not the worst thing in the world to spend a few minutes standing in line with fellow citizens before one votes. And that might give one reason to pause for reflection and to keep the needs and rights of those other citizens, and thus the common good, in mind. If we tell voters that this is all about you and about making it as easy as possible for you to vote, no matter how little interest you have in the election, we shouldn't be surprised if voters take the decision lightly and vote selfishly. The fundamental crisis of American elections now is not that it's too hard to vote. It's that we're creating a system that simultaneously trivializes the act of voting, while at the same time insisting that narrow, temporary majorities are entitled to have their way in passing legislation that radically affects their fellow citizens in virtually every aspect of life. And H.R. 1, of course, exemplifies that, with these very narrow majorities trying to ram through a bill that's with no measure of bipartisan support whatsoever. In the long run, this is the real danger to our elections, right? And it's why S1 needs to be defeated. Thank you.
Very good. Now, Mr. Weiner?
So I appreciate Professor Smith's recognition about the rarity of voter fraud, quote unquote, which of course our research has shown is, you're less likely to commit it than to be struck by lightning, either in person or vote by mail. But I want to zoom out a little bit before we get into some of the specifics. Our country is on a long path towards the vision of a more inclusive democracy. And I think to say that voting may or may not be easier now than it was in 1980 or whatever is to belie the extent to which so many people, disproportionately people of color, have long been excluded from our democratic community and from participation in our democratic society. And when you say voting should not be too easy, the burdens of who has to take more time to vote, who suffers more to exercise their fundamental right, does not fall evenly. It is okay for me to take some time off work and go stand in line on a Tuesday. I can do that. I have the type of job that I'm allowed to do that. It is not the same for someone who works hourly or someone who doesn't have the kind of job I have where they have that flexibility. And almost all of what these provisions in HR 1R do, the For the People Act do, is they try to make our voting process accessible to the folks in our society who have been shut out and for whom, it's not just as easy as booking a flight, because many of them don't have the resources to book a flight. And I do think we need to be, I say this with the utmost respect and not questioning your motives, but I think we need to be careful before we talk about the relative burdens of voting from the perspective of folks like ourselves. Now, in terms of specifics, you talked about the various reforms in the For the People Act. One thing I will say is I agree one of the central reforms is modernization of our voter registration system. And one aspect of that is automatic voter registration. I want to say, you mentioned other democracies. Most advanced democracies either do not require people to separately register to vote before casting a ballot, or they make registration automatic. And in fact, automatic voter registration has already been passed in 19 states in the District of Columbia, often by overwhelming bipartisan margins. It was passed unanimously in Illinois. It was passed with over 2/3 of the vote in Michigan. So this is not a policy that is a partisan policy. And in fact, in the states, it is a very, very bipartisan policy. automatic voter registration, is a common sense solution. Basically, what it means is that when you interact with a government agency, you are automatically registered unless you opt out. And there are ample opportunities to opt out of registration. And then your records are electronically transferred to election officials so that it cuts down on data entry and expenses, and frankly, also many, many, many opportunities for error. So it's a common sense system. It is not a system that is partisan. It's been adopted in very conservative states, in fact, red, blue, everything in between. It will not result in non-citizens voting. There are numerous safeguards written into the For the People Act to prevent anyone who is not eligible from voting from being registered or casting a ballot, nor does it make it so that if you are a non-citizen or you are otherwise ineligible and you intentionally vote, notwithstanding the law, it does not immunize you from prosecution. It does not change voter eligibility. And I truly, we just disagree. I do not think that that is a real problem. Non-citizen voting is also already vanishingly rare. No system is perfect. There's room for error in current voter registrations, and there is less room for error, but of course there could be some in this system, but it does not appreciably increase the risk. You referenced so-called ballot harvesting. I do respectfully have to say that I think ballot harvesting is a scare term. What we're talking about are ballot collection methods that are allowed in many places that are particularly valuable to rural voters, to disabled voters, to people who don't have easy access to transportation. And with the problems that we've seen with the Postal Service, I really do not think it is fair to just assume that everyone has reliable access to outgoing mail. Things like ballot tampering, coercion of voters, all the sort of parade of horribles we hear, those are and will remain illegal. This is not about allowing people to coerce other people into voting. It is simply making it more accessible. I would also take issue with the idea that the For the People Act federalizes elections in any way. What the For the People Act does is it sets a baseline standard for voting access in federal elections. Elections will continue to be administered by the states. And it is essentially a system whereby we just guarantee that your zip code doesn't determine the extent to which you have access to the ballot. There are a number of other issues raised here. Obviously, early voting is another matter that you raised. It exists in the vast majority of states already. I think it's a common sense solution. Voting on Tuesday in November is a remnant of essentially an agrarian society, which was keyed around the harvest, and for farm families that had to literally take a horse and buggy to the county seat. In today's modern society, it just doesn't make sense to make everyone vote then. And finally, vote by mail is also a very common, very accepted practice. Already, in many, many states of all political hues allow no excuse vote by mail. The For the People Act creates that as an option because, again, voters need options. And I do have to take issue also, it does not prohibit signature verification. It simply provides some sort of due process protections so that you don't have people arbitrarily disenfranchised. And again, I really want to get back to this theme that we need to be very, very cautious before talking about what is or isn't a fair burden for people to vote. In my view, respectfully, we are in the midst of an unprecedented wave of voter suppression that is essentially driven by a lie about the 2020 election. And we cannot divorce this conversation from that context. There's room always for respectful disagreement, but I do think that our democracy will be better off when everyone, regardless of their social economic status, regardless of their race, regardless of their background, has the ability to cast their ballot. I don't think people do it lightly. I think right now we do have a problem that too many people who want to participate in our democracy are being cut off from doing that. And I do think that this legislation is the solution.
Okay, very well. Thank you very much. We only have a few minutes left and a great number of questions. I have to apologize to the audience. We are not going to get to the questions. And I don't see any defective questions here at all. So I'm going to.
Can I actually just one?
Yes,
I'm sure this is one question that you have. It's also been said often that the For the People Act prohibits voter identification. For in-person voting, it doesn't even prohibit voter identification. It simply says that you have to be offered an alternative to sign a sworn statement to attest to your identity, which is, I think, a very reasonable thing for the up to 11% of our population that actually doesn't have it. So I imagine that might have been one of the questions that were asked, and I just thought I'd answer that.
One thing that I'm seeing from the questions is a concern about the allegations that racial minorities are being burdened or disadvantaged in the current voting process, or they're not. So if both of you all could address that. And Mr. Weiner, you already addressed to some degree, but feel free to go first on that with more details.
I just have to respectfully disagree. We had a situation where the result of our election, there was an attempt to overturn it that almost uniformly targeted communities that were predominantly communities of color. And I think that there's reams and reams and reams of evidence in the state, including vastly disproportionate wait times, including discriminatory purge practices, that yes, communities of color are being targeted. They do at times, thankfully, overcome that targeting. But I do think it's beyond dispute that voting is harder if you're a Black American or a Brown American than it is for too many white Americans. And we need to fix that.
I think one thing we should note is that, oddly enough, these claims of massive voter suppression correspond with an incredible rise in minority participation in elections, so that in many states now, African-American turnout is now exceeding white turnout. We're at a very high level of turnout. We really seem to be making tremendous progress toward that egalitarianism. And I think using language like that this is a massive voter suppression like we haven't seen, I think is terribly detrimental to the process, because it's just so unmoored from reality here. I just really have to say that. I did that, by the way. I wish Dan hadn't gone to the very end, because I was going to end on such a positive note, which is many of the things he says, I think that there could be agreement on. For example, I think, for example, a better solution to early voting and all these no-fault absentee votes is to make Election Day a national holiday, something that's been talked about for a long time. You could do something like that, maybe with a limited amount of early voting, and again, for excuse absentee voting, but preserving that public nature of it. You could do things like registration. Part of our problem, don't really have a problem with automatic registration, but this bill does it in a bad way that's going to lead you with all kinds of duplicate registrations and then very hard to clean up the rolls and so on. And part of that is because I think it does federalize things. It doesn't let states do their own, and it's trying to figure out what are the ways we can kind of force states to do this, get all these different registrations together. And part of that, again, is that there was no sort of good faith effort to really come forward. Now, maybe it wouldn't have been met in good faith. That wouldn't be the response. But there's no good faith effort to come forward and say, okay, let's see, we have some discrete problems that we think we should address. Instead, again, you have this massive bill based on a false narrative that voting is really hard in the United States today, and that is simply not true. And more, I think, again, this focus on the idea that it's all about how many people you can get to the polls one way or another is in the long term very detrimental to our democracy. Well,
I want to briefly respond, but also first say that I trust and I hope, and I want to make sure that none of my comments were intended certainly for you, Brad, or for anyone to question motives or a sense. I think we do disagree about the extent of the voter suppression problem right now in our country. And I also don't think that the fact that voting for some people, or even for many people, may be easier relative to 40 years ago is an appropriate benchmark. But I do appreciate the tenor of your conversation. I do think that there might be some room for common ground on some of these issues. Certainly don't oppose something like an Election Day holiday, although I would note that many working class people have to work on holidays. So I don't think it's a complete solution. I think that the reality is that the vast majority of the voting proposals in the For the People Act are bipartisan. They've been approved by overwhelming bipartisan margins at the state level, and that they've been shaped, in fact, by election officials of both parties. So I do disagree that this is a bill that is only driven by one party. I think, in fact, and as we've seen from polling, its provisions are extremely popular across the ideological and partisan spectrum. I think that if there was possibility for bipartisan legislation that would actually achieve the fundamental goals of the bill, folks would jump at it. I regret that I'm not sure there is right now, but I don't think that that's a question of bad faith on the part of the bill sponsors.
Sometimes if you want bipartisan cooperation, people have to compromise and recognize that they can't get every objective that they want.
Republicans controlled the Senate the last time. If Senator McConnell had wanted to let the bill go to the floor and have a bipartisan negotiation over it, that could have happened. That being said, I appreciate the tenor of this conversation, and I do appreciate that, it was a more reality-based conversation than some of the ones that I've had. And I hope that at least to some extent you feel the same.
Thank you very much. I want to thank both of our debaters, Mr. Dan Weiner of the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University and Professor Brad Smith at the Institute for Free Speech. I also want to thank all the audiences, all the audience members. All the questions that came in are very helpful. And I'd like to thank the Federalist Society for allowing us to put this debate on. And with that, we are adjourned until next time.
Thank you, David. And also thank you to the Federalist Society for hosting this conversation.
Thank you.